There is a stretch of pipeline in western Ukraine, running through the Brody oil hub, buried under farmland that has been cratered by Russian drones for over 4 years. That came closer to collapsing the European Union's support for Ukraine than any single battlefield defeat, any political crisis, or any disagreement over strategy. It is called the Druzhba pipeline. The word means friendship, and for 3 months, the absence of oil flowing through it held 90 billion euros hostage. On April 23, 2026, EU ambassadors formally approved the disbursement of that 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine, the largest single financial commitment the bloc has ever made to a country at war. Alongside it, they adopted the 20th package of sanctions against Russia, a sprawling set of restrictions that targets everything from shadow fleet tankers to cryptocurrency exchanges to Russian cybersecurity firms. Both had been blocked for months. Both were unlocked by the same thing: the resumption of Russian oil flows through a Soviet-era pipeline to Hungary and Slovakia. This is the story of how a pipeline repair became the most consequential act of infrastructure maintenance in modern European history. And it is the story of how one man's departure from power may have reshaped the continent's security architecture more profoundly than any weapons shipment. To understand why this matters, you need to understand how close Ukraine came to financial collapse. By late March 2026, Bloomberg reported that Ukraine risked running out of money to pay for its defense within 2 months. The country's public debt had ballooned to 99% of GDP. Its own revenues covered military spending, but everything else, civil servant salaries, social payments, critical infrastructure repair, depended entirely on Western financial support. The head of the Verkhovna Rada's financial committee, Danilo Getmantsev, warned in an interview with Forbes Ukraine that the state was already spending its budget for the second half of the year. At the rate things were going, he said, the government would have no funds left to cover its expenses by mid-April. Ukraine needed external support worth $52 billion in 2026 alone. And the single largest chunk of that, the 90 billion euro EU loan agreed in principle at the European Council in December 2025, was frozen. Not because of a policy disagreement, not because of a strategic miscalculation, because of a pipeline. On January 27, 2026, a Russian drone strike severely damaged infrastructure near the Brody oil hub in western Ukraine, halting the flow of crude through the southern leg of the Druzhba pipeline. This is the branch that feeds Hungary and Slovakia, 2 EU member states that remain dependent on Russian oil, and whose leaders had spent years cultivating close relationships with Moscow. For Hungary, the pipeline was not just an energy artery, it was a political instrument. Viktor Orban had endorsed the 90 billion euro loan at the December summit. He had secured an opt-out for Hungary, meaning Budapest would not be on the hook for any of the borrowing. And then, in February, he vetoed the loan's implementation, citing the interruption of Druzhba oil flows as justification. The move stunned other EU leaders. One senior diplomat described it as a turning point in relations between Brussels and Budapest. What made it especially galling was that it was Russia's strike that had damaged the pipeline in the first place. Orban was, in effect, punishing Ukraine for being attacked. The standoff dragged on through February, March, and into April. Ukraine said the damage was severe: destroyed high-pressure pumps, wrecked control systems, underground pipe damage that could not be assessed from satellite imagery. On January 29th, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha posted photographs on social media showing the extensive destruction and ongoing fires at the Brody hub, officially attributing the disruption to Russian aggression and citing force majeure to international partners. Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico accused Zelensky of lying, claiming he had satellite images showing the route was functional. Zelensky fired back that satellite photographs cannot show shattered control panels. Fico's rhetoric escalated further when he told reporters that his distrust of the Ukrainian leader was so absolute that he did not even believe Zelensky has a nose between his eyes. The two sides traded accusations while Ukraine's treasury bled dry. The situation was most critical for Slovakia. Unlike Hungary, which has multiple refining facilities and larger storage capacity, Slovakia is almost entirely dependent on a single refinery, Slovnaft, specifically configured for Russian crude. Despite the total cessation of oil transit, the Slovak government maintained public silence for over 2 weeks, only acknowledging the disruption on the 18th of February after external reports forced the issue. Fico justified the delay by saying the government did not want to spread panic. Meanwhile, Orban made the Druzhba dispute a centerpiece of his re-election campaign, framing the crisis as one in which Zelensky was deliberately withholding energy from Hungary. It was classic Orban: convert a complex geopolitical situation into a simple narrative of national grievance, then ride that narrative to the ballot box. It did not work. On April 12, 2026, Hungary voted. The result was not close. Peter Magyar's Tisza party secured 138 seats in the 199-seat parliament, a two-thirds supermajority, on 53.6% of the vote. Orban's Fidesz collapsed to just 55 seats with 37.8%. Turnout was nearly 80%. In his victory speech to tens of thousands of supporters gathered along the Danube, Magyar said his voters had rewritten history. The scale of the defeat is difficult to overstate. Orban had governed Hungary for 16 years. He had rewritten the constitution, restructured the judiciary, captured much of the media landscape, and built a political machine that fused institutional control with ideological narrative. He had positioned himself as the EU's chief disruptor, blocking migration agreements, delaying Ukraine support, cultivating relationships with both Putin and Trump, and using veto power as leverage in ways that left Brussels in a state of permanent frustration. All of it came apart in a single night. Former US President Barack Obama called it a victory for democracy, not just in Europe, but around the world. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said simply, "Hungary has chosen Europe." For the Druzhba standoff, Orban's defeat was seismic. Magyar had signaled during the campaign that he expected the outgoing government to drop the veto once the pipeline was repaired. In an interview with Hungarian public television, he said plainly, "If Druzhba restarts, Viktor Orban will release his technical veto." He was right. The broader European reaction told its own story. French President Emmanuel Macron welcomed a victory which shows the attachment of the Hungarian people to the values of the European Union. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said, "Let's join forces for a strong, secure, and above all, united Europe." Poland's Donald Tusk posted on social media, with a dig at Orban's relationship with Moscow, "Back together, glorious victory, dear friends," followed by a line in Hungarian, "Russians, go home." Even Zelensky struck a diplomatic note, saying Ukraine had always sought good neighborly relations with everyone in Europe, and was ready to advance cooperation with Hungary. For Moscow, the result was a clear setback. Orban had been, if not an ally, then certainly a useful outlier inside the EU, a leader who could be relied upon to delay, obstruct, and soften the bloc's response to Russian aggression. With his departure, the Kremlin lost its most reliable point of internal leverage within European institutions. On April 21st, just 9 days after the election, Zelensky announced that Ukraine had completed repairs to the damaged pipeline section. The timing was not coincidental. Ukraine had been reluctant to rush repairs, citing security concerns and technical difficulties. Brussels had even offered to pay for the fix with EU funds and send technical experts to the damaged site, a key request from Orban that Ukraine had resisted. But with Magyar's victory, the political calculus shifted. A repaired pipeline would remove Orban's excuse, unlock the loan, and lay the groundwork for a fundamentally different relationship with Budapest under the incoming government. European Council President Antonio Costa thanked Zelensky publicly. EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas said she expected the veto to be lifted within 24 hours. The Cypriot presidency of the EU Council, sensing the window of opportunity, added the loan to the ambassadors' meeting agenda before Zelensky had even formally confirmed the repair. On Wednesday, April 22nd, ambassadors gave preliminary approval. On Thursday, April 23rd, with no objections raised, the loan was formally adopted. 2 months of paralysis ended in 48 hours. Now step back and look at the scale of what was just unlocked. The €90 billion loan is structured across 2 years, €45 billion for 2026 and €45 billion for 2027. The 2026 tranche breaks down as follows: €28.3 billion for military support and €16.7 billion for financial assistance. Payments will be conditional on reforms, particularly anti-corruption measures, and any reversal in those reforms could trigger a temporary suspension. There are several details buried in the structure that are worth highlighting. First, the military strand contains Made in Europe provisions designed to ensure that as much funding as possible flows to European and Ukrainian defense producers rather than American manufacturers. This is not a minor clause. It represents a deliberate EU effort to build its own defense industrial base on the back of Ukraine support, turning wartime aid into peacetime industrial strategy. As we covered in our earlier video on the Germany-Ukraine partnership deal, this is part of a broader European trend. converting short-term military assistance into long-term production capacity. Second, the loan's repayment terms are extraordinary. Ukraine will only be asked to return the 90 billion euros if Russia ever agrees to pay war reparations, something Moscow has categorically refused to do. In practical terms, this means the loan functions as a grant. The EU is borrowing on capital markets. The 24 participating member states will pay roughly 3 billion euros per year in interest, and Ukraine is unlikely to ever repay the principal. Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic have opted out of the borrowing arrangement under the Enhanced Cooperation Procedure. Third, European Economic Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis indicated that the first disbursement could arrive by late May or early June 2026. For a country that was weeks away from running out of money, that timeline is the difference between keeping the lights on and a genuine fiscal emergency. But the loan was only half the story. Alongside it, the EU adopted its 20th package of sanctions against Russia, the most comprehensive set of restrictions in over 2 years. The sanctions package is built around several pillars. On energy, it introduces a full maritime services ban on Russian crude and refined products, to be coordinated with the G7 before implementation. Bans on technical and financial services for Russian-flagged icebreakers and LNG tankers took effect from 25th April. From January 2027, it will be illegal to provide LNG terminal services to Russian entities or those controlled by Russian nationals. Transaction bans have been placed on the ports of Murmansk and Tuapse in Russia, and on the Karimun oil terminal in Indonesia, all identified as nodes used to circumvent the oil price cap. On finance, the package targets 20 additional Russian banks and 4 financial institutions in third countries, in Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, for enabling sanctions circumvention. Kyrgyzstan became the first country hit by the EU's anti-circumvention tool, with bans on the sale of metal-cutting machines, modems, and routers to the country. The package also introduces a total sectoral ban on Russian-based cryptocurrency providers and platforms, targeting Moscow's growing reliance on digital currencies for international transactions. It designates a Kyrgyz entity involved in trading the government-backed stablecoin A7A5, and bans EU support for the development of the digital ruble. On the military-industrial complex, 58 companies and associated individuals involved in manufacturing military goods, including drones, have been designated. 16 entities based in China, the UAE, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Belarus have been targeted for providing dual-use goods or weapon systems to Russia. 60 new entities will face tighter export restrictions on items that contribute to Russia's defense sector. The package also introduces mandatory due diligence checks for tanker sales, a direct strike at the shadow fleet that has helped Russia evade the oil price cap. There is a human dimension too. 5 individuals and 1 entity have been listed for enabling the abduction, forced transfer, and indoctrination of Ukrainian children. 4 propagandists, including those with state-sponsored platforms, have been designated. The EU has expanded its broadcasting prohibitions to cover mirror sites that circumvent existing bans on Russian state media. And in a move that signals just how deeply sanctions enforcement has evolved, the package introduces new legal safeguards to protect EU companies from abusive Russian court rulings, specifically from Russian counter-sanctions that involve the expropriation of EU assets or violations of intellectual property rights. This is the kind of provision that does not make headlines, but reshapes the legal architecture of economic warfare. As we covered in our previous video on Russia's economic vulnerabilities following the Hormuz blockade, Moscow has already lost significant revenue streams in 2026. The 20th sanctions package is designed to close the gaps that remain, particularly the shadow fleet, third country circumvention networks, and cryptocurrency channels that have kept Russian finances functioning despite years of restrictions. There is a contrast buried in this story that deserves attention. For 3 months, one man, Viktor Orban, held the entire European security architecture to ransom over an oil pipeline. He blocked 90 billion euros in support to a country at war. He delayed the 20th round of sanctions that targeted the aggressor in that war. He did this not because he had a policy objection to the loan, he had endorsed it in December, but because he wanted leverage. Leverage for his energy supply, leverage for his re-election campaign, leverage for a political model in which disruption is indistinguishable from strategy. And then his own people removed him. The Hungarian electorate, with a turnout of nearly 80%, delivered the most emphatic rejection of an incumbent government in the country's democratic history. Within 10 days of that election, the pipeline was repaired, the veto was lifted, the loan was approved, and the sanctions were adopted. There is a lesson in this for the EU, and it is not a comfortable one. The bloc's decision-making architecture, built on consensus and unanimity in foreign policy, means that a single member state can hold 26 others hostage. Orban exploited that vulnerability relentlessly. The fact that it took an election to break the deadlock is not a testament to the system's resilience. It is an indictment of its fragility. If Magyar had not won, if Orban had secured another term, the 90 billion euros would still be frozen. Ukraine's budget would be in crisis, and the 20th sanctions package would still be sitting on a shelf in Brussels. The EU dodged a bullet, but it dodged it because Hungarian voters pulled the trigger on their own government, not because the institution had a mechanism to override a bad faith veto. Peter Magyar takes office next month. His agenda is ambitious: join the European Public Prosecutor's Office, restore judicial independence, safeguard academic freedom, end Hungary's reliance on Russian oil and gas by 2035, review the POX nuclear project, largely built and financed by Russia, and raise defense spending toward NATO's 5% of GDP benchmark by 2035. He has pledged to pursue a cooperative approach with the EU while defending national interests, and he has spoken twice with Ursula von der Leyen, who pledged her support. European Commission officials met Magyar's team in Budapest just 5 days after his election victory to begin the process of unfreezing 17 billion euros in EU funds that had been withheld over rule of law concerns. Of the 27 billion euros earmarked for Hungary, 17 billion euros remains frozen. The clock is ticking. Hungary stands to lose nearly 10 billion euros if payments are not dispersed before the end of August. But there are uncertainties. Magyar ruled out troop deployments to Ukraine and a return to conscription. He has been deliberately vague on some aspects of his Ukraine policy. And Orban is not leaving politics. He will serve from the opposition, wounded but still commanding a formidable political machine. Fidesz retains 55 seats, deep local networks, and a media ecosystem that took 16 years to construct. What happened on 23 April 2026 was not just an approval of a loan. It was a stress test of the European project, and the European project nearly failed. 90 billion euros, 20 packages of sanctions, 16 years of Orban's obstruction, 3 months of a pipeline standoff, 1 election, and a Soviet-era tube of steel that carries Russian crude through Ukrainian soil to feed Hungarian refineries. On Thursday morning, oil was flowing through that pipeline again. So was the money. The Druzhba pipeline means friendship. On this particular day, the friendship that mattered most was not between Moscow and Budapest. It was between 24 EU member states who agreed to borrow 90 billion euros on behalf of a country fighting for its survival, and a Hungarian electorate that decided, after 16 years, that obstruction was no longer a strategy worth voting for. The oil flows east to west. The money flows west to east. And somewhere in Brussels, a diplomat is probably already drafting a proposal to make sure that one country can never hold this kind of leverage again. Whether that proposal goes anywhere is another story entirely.